looking through the names here. Welcome, everybody, to Cybernetics Live. Very glad that you're here for our session and our discussion. Welcome also particularly to Angus, Angus Jenkinson. Interesting title, Angus. EcoCybernetics, Rerouting Cybernetics in the Living. Interesting as ever. And thank you for attending and for presenting today. Peter Trudenham will lead the discussion at the end. It falls to me, Peter Kavalik, just to make this introduction. So welcome to Angus again. And basically, multiple author, consultant, researcher, ecologist, I think. And I think we can also maybe reference your past professorship and current, did you say researcher, visiting researcher?
No, I'm actually a fellow. Yes, I'm a fellow in Belgian University.
Fellow, even better. Thank you, Angus, and you're very welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't see everybody because I'm looking, I've got this screen on full screen at the beginning, but I imagine that there are some old friends amongst, but some who don't know me so well, although you've just heard it. My topic, as you can see, has already been given, and I'll be explaining more about it. It's a kind of provocation that I'm proposing to think about cybernetics potentially in a new way for some of you, rerouting it in the living. And the implication is that it has tended to be rooted in something else. I have got some background in the Cybernetics Society. I'm very pleased to have been active in it in the recent past. And I find cybernetics to be a really important part of my thinking. But as you already heard from Peter, it's an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work that I do, and that really fits very well with cybernetics, which is I think, in many ways, one of the ultimate, if not the ultimate, transdisciplinary science. So I have a thesis that I am proposing in this session, and I want to take you through my propositions with you, treat it as a provocation, then have some discussion. And the thesis is that cybernetics is best rooted in the living, living from single cells and, in fact, back everything that's in the single cells through to ecosystems. Perhaps even below single cells, of course, bacteria, there are very many free living life forms below the level of the eukaryotic cells. So cybernetics is best rooted in the living. That's the thesis. And the key claim that I'm making is that individual and collective organisms enact reflexive self-control and interaction shaped by life cycles and limits of sentient feedback. Could also say frames of sentient feedback, or the Umwelt. That will obviously need a little bit of unpacking, but just briefly, individual and collective organisms, and many individual organisms like you or me are really also collective organisms or communal organisms. So we are social organisms, another name that's used. We enact, that means we do, but we also possess within our embodied state reflexive self-control. I think you're all familiar with many core cybernetic terms, and so these will be familiar to you. And interaction shaped by life cycles and limits or frames of sentient feedback. Now, the key here at this point is the sentience in that feedback and the differentiation between this kind of feedback and machine type feedback, energy flowing back, for example. So in the permafrost melting in the north, what we have is a feedback system in which the warming landscape produces a situation where more ice and snow melts, the reduced ice and snow leads to faster warming, which leads to more rapid melting, which leads to faster, and that's an energy feedback. We're talking here about sentient living systems and the sentient-based feedback. And my aim is to introduce EcoCybernetics as a perceptual reorientation, not a renaming. I think that we don't actually even need second-order cybernetics. I think that's all implicit within cybernetics, or even arguably explicit within cybernetics. So I don't think we need another name unless we need it to help to frame a particular way of seeing it. And so this can be thought of in the same way as there are different kinds of physics, if perhaps. At this point, I could ask you a question, and if I was interacting with you in an open space, I would ask you and ask you to give some feedback. Because the question at this point is this really so obvious to you all that cybernetics is rooted in the living? Is that really so obvious to you that your real question is, so what? I mean, what difference does it make if we decide that it's rooted in the living? Or is your response more in the nature of, well, is that really true? Is it really rooted there? What about all of this, all of the stuff we've been doing with AI and robots and machine intelligence and so forth over the years? Isn't it more rooted in that area? That's certainly how cybernetics is often understood. Well, let me briefly say a little bit about the so what issue for those of you who are saying, why is this important? Why do we even need to think about this? Why does this really matter? And I think it relates to the way that the world is seen and the consequences of the way the world is seen. Case in point, I'd like to indicate, back in the 1950s, 1957, 58, the very eminent biologist Francis Crick proposed the central dogma. That's what he called it. The central dogma of, although it was claimed to be molecular biology, it really became the central dogma of all biology and all understanding of living forms. And this ruled the biological theory until very recently. Many people still think it's what rules biological theory. This was the theory that said that the DNA, basically, the popular version of it is the selfish gene. The DNA rules everything, and you can describe all sorts of traits and phenomena and characteristics of living forms according to their DNA. And so even in business terms, it was very common to talk about it being, these values are in our DNA, that kind of expression. Well, we could have saved what has been described as 50 wasted years or 50 lost years if the members of the Macy Conference, who should have known better, and if they'd thought about it carefully, would have known better, had been more alert and more effective. And given the wide range of extremely influential people in the biological fields at that time, who and medicine and so forth, who were involved in it, they really could have done more, because it's quite clear what we now know is that that is a highly limited view. It's really, in the way it was couched as a dogma, it's really wrong. It's wrong because it fails to recognize that DNA is responsive to its context. The analogy that's been given is that DNA is really an organ, and the organ player plays the notes or chords that it wants played, the tune that it wants played. And depending on the particular chords and tune that it plays, so the particular enzymes, proteins, and so on, which is what DNA produces, are produced. But there is an organ player. And what's the organ player? The organ player is the context, the environment, the body. And that's context is, of course, the moment you hear the word context, you know that you are listening to a cybernetic concept, a core concept of cybernetics. This is the world responding to its environment. And right down there inside the cell, this process is taking place. the cell is giving signals, and the cell in turn is receiving those signals from the environment, and DNA is performing. That means that instead of DNA being in charge, being the selfish gene, and human beings being lumbering robots, actually DNA is doing what it's told. I'm probably putting it a bit crudely, just as it was put somewhat crudely very often over the years. But I'm talking about an inversion and an understanding. And 50 years later, you can, for example, 2011, the Linnaean Society, I'd use that as a marker, writes a long paper indicating why they effectively say that that way of seeing biology is no longer fit for purpose. So we could have saved a lot of time there, and we could have saved a lot of time in lots of other fields where we've been creating as human beings and civilization lots of unintended consequences. I'm very close at the moment and involved in the environment with ecology and agriculture. And for 100 years, people have been saying, the farmers, the landowners and so on have been saying that plants need nitrogen. We've been using up that nitrogen. So we have to put nitrogen onto the soil. We have to make nitrogen using a chemical process. We have to put these products onto the soil. And nitrogen is the great boon that has saved humanity by enabling the production. But what we failed to recognize is that the reason why we were running out of nitrogen is because of the farming methods that we were using, and that the addition of chemical nitrogen accelerates that process. And what we've been doing is degrading and destroying our soils across the globe, so that today agriculture contributes 22% of carbon emissions. And globally, varies, of course, country to country, and yet it could be reversed. It could be completely reversed, and nitrogen and farming has the ability to do the reverse. We can sequester more carbon than is emitted, a lot more carbon than is emitted, and we can transform nature if we did it differently. So how we see the world, I suggest, determines the world that we produce. This is a basic principle again that we find very current in cybernetics. And if how we see the world determines the world that we form and the world that we understand, then it makes sense to see the world differently. And indeed, one of the most fundamental aspects of cybernetics would be the learning process, whereby we recognize that seeing the world the way we do is producing unintended consequences. There must be a better way of seeing it. So if we don't do that, then we create crises. We have been creating crises, and I think the modern industrial mindset offers diminished variety. It therefore lacks requisite variety for adequate, good life on this planet, for all of the mixed ecology that's needed for that to be successful. It degrades, therefore, both nature and our manner of seeing it, because it becomes an ongoing process. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. So what do I mean by an eco-cybernetic perspective? Can I give some examples of that? Why would I claim that the cybernetics of life begins with the ecology of perception? If we go back to some of the history, there was a very important paper published in 1943 by Rosenpluth, Wiener, and Bigelow. It was called Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology. It contains a number of content, but I've selected a couple of sections, phrases or sentences out of it, quite close together near the beginning. The view has often been expressed that all machines are purposeful. This view is untenable. So they're making a differentiation between all machines and some other way by which something can be considered to be related to what they are proposing, which is that behavior can be purposeful or teleological. And they go on to say, we consider purposefulness a conceptual necessity, a concept necessary for the understanding of certain modes of behavior. The term purposeful is meant to denote that the act of behavior may be interpreted as directed to the attainment of the goal. Now, I consider that this paper is what really kicks off the cybernetic revolution in public. Of course, it had been going on in private in the communities of scientists that were meeting during the Second World War. But this kicks it off in public, and it's a really incredibly important seminal work. Now, why? Do I think it's the most really incredible because it kicks off a radical new science? I do. Um, is it because it was the notion of error correction, which is the fundamental notion they're talking about, that there's a correlation of activities in order to bring about activity towards a goal, and that is what constitutes the purposefulness? Yes, I think that's a really powerful notion and a really powerful insight about the world and its radical implications remain something that I don't think we've sufficiently explored. But I think there's another aspect which may be even more important, that it represents a radical new epistemology. And some of you will have heard me say what I'm about to say again, but not all of you, perhaps. And so forgive me. Why is it a radical new epistemology? It's because it includes this word purpose and the word teleology. So I'm not sure that teleology is a very useful word in this context because of the misunderstandings that were had about it. But let's at least point that what they were interested in is behavior towards goals or ends. And that's what is meant by teleology. Why is that so radical? Back around 1600, various figures, such as Galileo and Bacon, were in opposition to the dogma that had arisen around Aristotle over the centuries. They were also branching out in a new way of thinking about the world. During the 16th century, those new ways of thinking about the world also included radical changes in Christianity. And part of that was the growth of the Protestant oppositional group to the Catholics across Europe. And one of the effects of that was a 30 Years' War in which perhaps 15% or 20% of Europe died, along with lots of other destruction. The intelligentsia of the time came to the conclusion that this something was needed because, apart from anything else, when scientists said the wrong thing, the Catholic Church had the habit of burning them at the stake and doing other unspeakable things. In consequence, they decided that they needed to eliminate religion from science. And one of the key elements in that was to eliminate any concepts or language that might imply that there was a God involved in the process of science. It didn't mean they were not religious, didn't mean they didn't go to church. And in fact, Newton's papers were strongly influenced by conversations he had with the Church of England as to what they asked him to say and not say. But it did mean that they rejected certain core concepts that they saw dangerous. And one of the most important was purpose or design. The moment you introduce purpose or design, it was considered that the next thing that would come along is God. And the minute after that, what would come along is competitiveness, war, violence, and so forth. And so they eliminated any kind of activity that might imply purpose, that the world has been created by a purpose, it has purpose within it, and that there is any kind of design. And that perpetuated to the point that, of course, people forgot that that was the reason, but it became embedded in the whole causal theories that were embedded in modern science, and the principle that everything is the result of a deterministic logic deriving from the past through a causal chain that brings about the present. This was a big problem for sociologists, biologists, and otherwise, who saw lots of behavior that looked pretty purposeful. So they had to find ways of describing it. What what these figures did is they were sufficiently influential to be able to write and say, we actually think that this has to come back. We have to be able to describe this. And they were very careful how they did it, and especially they provided a mechanism to explain it, error correction. And that becomes the foundation for rethinking how the world works. And that's important because it starts to give us the opportunity to understand biology, life, sociology, organizations, and a whole raft of other things in our civilization. So this is a seminal moment. So this process, however, also takes place in the context of the war. And Wiener's research, and of course we know how influential he was in the context of creating anti-aircraft servo mechanisms that enable assistive technologies to enable gunners to shoot down planes more effectively. I'm not complaining about the fact that they were trying to shoot down planes, but what I'm saying is that this way in which he saw the machine, the servo mechanisms of the machine, and the operator of the gun as a single unit led to a kind of unification in which there was a sense that you could think about machines um, in the same way as you could think about humans. At least that is an argument, and you can find that in one of the papers that I cite at the end, Gallison. So at any rate, what we know is that there was a lot of investigation. They did a lot of science, and they were, as part of that science and investigation, they created lots of robots and things like that to help them to understand cybernetics in the early days. And they were a lot of fun, and they were really important, and we learned a lot of things from them, and we could derive a lot of mathematics from them. And that led to machine learning generally, and machine learning led in turn to robotics and AI. At a certain point, there was a big social conflict taking place around Wiener, and AI took off in a different name and a different direction to create separation from Wiener's involvement in machine learning. That's all part of history. Um, so what we have, though, is the situation where at a certain point, cybernetics becomes identified with the mechanistic, with machines, with AI, with engineering, and with all of those kinds of aspects of the discipline. And they're all very important. Um, but my proposition is that in the process of focusing on those, we're dealing with a much lower level of variety than what takes place in nature. And we've tended to apply what we learned from the mechanisms of nature and the very use of the term mechanism in biology to explain things back into nature. And in the process, we've lost sight of how nature actually works. And as we lose sight of how nature actually works, we actually degrade the world in which we live for ourselves in multiple ways. So, EcoCybernetics asserts that there's a symbiotic knowledge system for appreciating living systems. On the one hand, cybernetics is a primary source for understanding nature. On the other hand, the living world is a primary source for cybernetic theory and applications. We can learn by looking at how nature actually works, and we can use cybernetics to understand how nature works better. It's a core science for understanding it because it's beautifully placed to deal with the way that living forms interact with each other, how they respond to context, how they communicate with each other, how they interact. It is the prime science, I believe, for all aspects of ecology and life studies. And in the process, the closer we get to understand nature, the better we'll understand cybernetics and the way nature and our world and ourselves and our societies work. That's the symbiosis of knowledge and the synergy that I'm proposing is available to us. So, some that you are all familiar with various films that you've seen and so on, owls and predators zooming down upon plants, upon their prey. The focus of the cheetah's eyes focusing on the animal that it's chasing, for example, the dodging of the rabbit, the chasing of the fox. These kinds of images have been fed to us for decades through all of the different media channels that we've watched. You've all seen them, and you've probably seen them in the wild. And all of that is important, in two ways. One is I want to indicate how we've been seeing the world by a certain version. The BBC, for example, has fed a version of the world which has really been fed on an old notion of survival of the fittest in biology, and this, but it also makes good action movies. But at the same time, it has also shown us that there is this process whereby an organism focuses on what it's trying to achieve, looks at that, what it's trying to achieve, and responds to what is going on, adjusting its own behavior according to the situation in the world. So we can learn from that. I think we have to look at the semiotics of what was involved in a lot of those images. But the core principle that an organism, when it's trying to do something as simple, in your case or mine, as pick up a glass of water, drink it accurately, is focusing on something and getting feedback, error feedback, in order to do it. And Rosenbluth and company include an example of exactly that, picking up a glass of water, not being able to coordinate and hold your hand together and spilling the water over yourself. Plants have symbiosis, mycorrhizal networks that are going on, and I'm going to come back to that. Incredible transformation in our understanding of the world. The development of understanding of microbiomes, for example, in the gut, inside single cells, and so on. More and more, what we're starting to understand is that all living worlds are involved in deep, complex, interrelated forms that are in communication, and that living things, living systems that we did not appreciate or did not think of as having any kind of communicative ability do have very intelligent communication ability. One of the disciplines I would really like to see perceptual control theory and cybernetics come back together again. I'm not saying that I agree with every aspect of Powers' theory, his organization of the neurology and so on. I'm not sure that I think that some of that's going to need evolving, but the basic core principle that's described in perceptual control theory, namely that living organisms control their behavior through their control of perception, is, I think, profoundly important. This is a key to understanding how things work, and that's why I gave the examples I just did a few moments ago. Its core idea is that behavior equals control of perception. And that means that we are organisms that act to keep perception within reference states. And these reference states include, for example, body temperature, the level of oxygen in the blood, the rate of breathing, and a whole variety of different things. So homeostasis, which is one of the fundamentals of cybernetics, as well as of biology, as well as of the management of an organization or company, is a way of keeping a whole range of reference states in correlation with each other in the right condition for what they need to be. Organisms are also hierarchical controllers. That means that they have feedback loops within recursive structures, and that these serve reference values for homeostasis and purpose. So the organism is purposefully maintaining its own homeostasis, its own existence in a healthy state or in a reference state, and it is acting and responding to its situation in its own environment. Perceptual control theory provides a number of useful formal living derived cybernetics describing the control of these internal states for doing this and how this actually works as an error correction. So it links back very directly to the Rosenbluth and Co. paper of 1943. So we can look at some other theoretical anchors that are relevant to this. Von Uexküll's Umwelt notion from 1934, his wonderful book, A Stroll Through the World of Animals and Men, described a tick, the life cycle of a tick. And if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. But this notion of the Umwelt or environment or milieu, it's a bit deeper. It's the own world, Umwelt, the own world of a particular, each creature has its own species specific world. And of course, with human beings, we each have our own human, individual, specific world that we know. And so we, in a sense, world our own world. Peter, you'll remember that we did a shared session on this. We world our own world by the way, means by which we perceive the world. And so if we can upgrade the way that we see the world, we can also upgrade how we act in the world. I think that this goes all the way back to Aristotle's entelekaia, which means being at work, staying itself. So this was perhaps his most fundamental notion, that everything, that all living things, and indeed all existing, ongoing existing states, consist of the process whereby they are being at work, staying itself. And that, of course, you can link that to the much more modern, recent work of Maturana and Varela with autopoiesis. And my own work was derived from learning from this. My concept of propriopoiesis, which I described in a book that's in a paper that's referenced later. Metamorphosis is another core concept that you may or may not be familiar with. It's Goethe's incredibly resonant and important insight into the way that organisms maintain their own internal state through morphological thematic patterning. So, for example, all the leaves of a plant, if you take a tree, every leaf is itself a living plant, and all of those plants share a common pattern. You can see that on an oak tree, they are all oak tree leaves, and on a fir tree, they're all fir tree leaves. But every single one is individual, and they also take on forms according to where they are in their context. And this is very notable in an annual flowering plant. This principle also is found in the bone structures of the body, and indeed throughout the organism, you can identify that every single aspect of the organism is something like a theme and variation. It's a morphology of the whole. So that the whole sets up a kind of core pattern, an ur pattern, and this ur pattern is reflected in variety, but it's reflected by the own activity of the organism within its own self, creating its own internal variety in order to be what it is. And that's an area that I think cybernetics could work on further and go further in. So a few canonical propositions I put to you, 6 of them. First, living primacy, that cybernetic principles derive from living self-control first, machines second. Cells, by the way, are routinely communal. A single cell is in fact a communal creature. A human being has perhaps 3 trillion cells and is therefore also a communal creature. Selves, in that sense, there are multiple levels of self, in inverted commas, in this process. So cybernetic principles derive from living self-control first, machines second, and that means that machines are really doing biomimicry. Principle 2, it's hierarchical control. Organisms use nested control loops tied to life cycles. There is the context determines, but the context is mutual. So the state of a cell tells the environment what it needs, and the state of the environment for the cell tells the cell what it needs. Sentient frames, each organism's world is equal to the scope of its interpretive sentience, i.e., contextual apprehension, or Umwelt. So the world of the organism derives from the scope of its interpretive sentience, what it's capable of perceiving in the world through its various forms of sentience, and how it interprets those constitutes its world. This is an information-based principle, therefore also for feedback, not an energy feedback. And Rosenbluth and co. make that clear in their paper right back in 1943. Principle 4, the distributed co-agency. Agency in this sense meaning the purposeful action towards ends. Control forms through multiple scales, from the eukaryotes and other such submicroscopic creatures, through cells, microbiomes, organs, the matrix in which they sit. I think we underestimate, for example, the fluid matrix of the body, and the through to organisms and ecosystems. So there's multiple agencies happening at all levels of this. This is a ladder of Umwelten. And the same thing can be applied to companies. So one of the things I've been interested in is thinking about how companies work in the same kind of way, obviously at the higher scales. Principle 5, co-contextual feedback. That there's environment and learning shape, reference, steering values. This is structural coupling. And I refer you to the net of Indra, which was very important for some of the first mathematical scientists of physics in the 1920s, when they were developing their new scientific field. They couldn't understand the physics that was coming out of this process. And the net of Indra, which is a Buddhist concept in which there's an incredible, innumerable host of globes, each of which is, as it were, reflecting every other globe in this net of Indra. So all reflects all the way through. So in other words, organisms are constantly giving and receiving feedback from each other. And when we look at the world, we are being looked at in inverted commas, and I hope we can get time to say a little bit more about that. Self-referential metamorphosis, so the thematic variations that I already talked about in and across species, so that there's a relationship between them. And this means that we can displace some of the emergence notions in which things come about through sort of random interactions. Rather, things come about through the internal self-referential integrity that is formed. And there's a lot to learn about how that works, I think, that is not yet understood. So various implications follow from this. It's a long possible list. Systems theories need reevaluation. Agriculture, food, and health systems need reevaluation. Education needs reevaluation. Peacekeeping needs reevaluation. I'll ask you, what do you think we might need to do? What are the opportunities for us to reevaluate if we start to think more on a nature-based way of understanding the world? So I'm saying life itself, nature, and society are at root formed, sustained, and evolved by the dynamic co-weaving of responsive life. This is the source of cybernetics as a discipline. Its deployment in machines is a form of biomimicry, and some of the core terms for a core principle exploring the way life does and machines can navigate to outcomes in co-responsive world is what I've been trying to explore with you. This was the provocation that I shared with you at the beginning. I want to end with my presentation. If I can just stop sharing. I hope that I have been. There we go. I'm finding it difficult to.
I'll see if I can do it for you.
Yeah, thanks. Right.
There you go.
I'd like to obviously invite questions and conversation. So I've put out some provocations, and it may well be that the conversations can take place between people who've been listening rather than just with me. I'd like to tell you a couple of stories just before I hand over to that process that I think interestingly reflect some of these aspects. There's a lady called Suzanne Simard. You may have heard of her. she published a paper in 1997 in Nature. Nature was so impressed by the importance of this paper that they made it, for this particular edition of the journal, they made it the front cover picture, and they coined the term Wood Wide Web. It wasn't her coining, it was the journal Nature's. The editor wrote a piece about the importance of this notion, and it was they coined the term Wood Wide Web, which I suspect you've all heard of. What was the backstory and what was the content of this particular 1997 paper? Suzanne Simard was a woman, number one. Really important to know that she was a woman. That means she was also in a male-centered scientific forester world at the time. She worked for the Forestry Commission, Canada, and she was trained in orthodox forestry, botany, biology, and so forth. She took in the ordinary rules. She was qualified to do the work, and she was a very good. And part of what her early life led her to do was how to do experimentation. And part of it, being a good experimenter, is she actually started looking at the world, and she got very intrigued by some phenomena. And to cut what is a long story short, and she describes the long story in her fantastic autobiography, Finding the Mother Tree, she describes how she noticed that trees seemed to be communicating with each other and doing more than just communicating with each other, they were helping each other. And this was in a context in which the rule was that when they were cutting down the trees, because these were commercial woodlands, they'd cut down all the trees and they'd clear cut them, eliminate every tree there so that you had a nice clean ground in which you could plant the next generation of trees that were to grow. And she started to get skeptical about this. And that's what led her to the notion of a mother tree. And the notion of the mother tree was that there are older mature trees, and these older mature trees will feed and look after younger trees. Now, this was a pretty shocking notion at the time. To begin with, and I won't go into all the details of the experimentation that she did, which was very thorough and extensive and lasted in several cases experiments over several years. She was able to prove conclusively that older mature trees would feed, first of all, they would privilege other trees, young trees that needed it, of their own species. But they would also, if they had spare resources, also feed other trees of other species to support the woodland. And feed in this case means water and nutrient, nitrogen and so forth. And the way that this was happening was through fungal networks. And that the fungal networks were able to communicate between the plants because they had silicon strands at the heart of their mycorrhizal networks. So information flows as well as nutrients and so on were flowing between the various trees. And they were also able in due course to prove that the whole forests were in communication with each other and operated as a kind of unified ecosystem entity with shared intelligence and shared responsiveness. That has become in recent years, the last 20 years and 25 years, has become an incredibly exciting notion and now is mainstream thinking. She's one of two women who've been involved in really understanding how fungus plays a vital role in the connectivity of life in the plant world. And I'm involved in agriculture, and I heard a story last week. I was in an agricultural conference, it was run by the Biodynamic Association. There were scientists and researchers and practitioners from across the world. And one of the farmers who was there told a story. Back in 1922 in England, there was a big drought by English standards. It was really bad. He was on holiday on the south coast, and the grass, the plants everywhere was dry, brown, dead, really difficult conditions. He has a big farm, relative by British standards, and it's a very good farm. It's a fantastic farm. It captures 10 times more carbon than it emits. And key to that is planting rich meadow lays, 25 or so species of plants in the field. He expected when he came back that quite possibly his field would be like the others, all brown. It was not. It was still green. The fields around were brown. The other farmers nearby, they were brown. His was green. What was interesting was that even the plants in the fields that had shallow roots were still green. And they were still green because they were being given water by deep-rooted plants that were bringing it up and feeding the neighboring plants. What that meant is that the rich mixture of plants that were growing together were not competing against each other. They were cooperating with each other. They were collaborating with each other. They were collaborating to the point that they were making use of different microecologies at different depths of the soil, and they were sharing information with each other and nutrients with each other, depending on what each of them could connect, and they were all connected by mycorrhizal networks. To me, that's the sort of thing that gives me a shiver, because it tells me that we need to really radically rethink the way nature works as a cooperative entity. And it is exactly that kind of shiver and that kind of learning that we need to reapply back into our civilization. Because if we don't learn how to live in that kind of way, and if we don't learn that nature works like that, and we carry on destroying it the way we do, and I could go on for a long time on how we do, I'm sure everybody in this room, in this group could too. If we keep doing it that way, we don't have a future in a healthy way for our civilization today. Other civilizations have died. This one could too. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you, Angus, for that comprehensive review of this topic, which I think is very close to the heart of most of us here, if I can say that. Certainly me, it resonates very deeply with my work on ocean literacy and earth literacy and my recent explorations into human condition. So I know we could go on for probably days on this topic, and we probably should. And so we can talk about that, how we develop this theme within the Cybernetic Society over coming weeks and months. But for this afternoon and this evening, we've got about another 40 minutes of Angus's time till past on the hour. So if you'd like to use the raise hand device on the Zoom or your physical hand, and I'll try and moderate a little bit in some form of question and answer process for that period of time, if that's agreeable with everyone. I think that's what Angus and I decided the other day. So thank you very much. And yeah, who would like to begin? I mean, I guess I suppose I could even, well, there you go. David's got a question. And then Margaret's got a question. So off you go, David. And try and make it a question, right? Because we don't have a lot of time. Let's try and make it as didactic as possible. Unmute yourself first, of course. It's always helpful. Can I help you?
Hello, Angus. In that case, Peter, I will begin by saying, would you agree that? And then say exactly what I was going to say anyway. So thank you very much, Angus. I think you've entirely succeeded in provoking, and it would be terribly boring if we always agreed with one another. And I think I want to congratulate you on providing another way in to cybernetics. I'm not too sure about the fundamentals of cybernetics. To me, there are an awful lot of foothills, and you can go up the mountain from a lot of directions. And we're interested in capturing as many people into an understanding of complex interactions across Professor of Marketing, I think you'd agree that cybernetics does have a bit of a marketing problem. I tend to begin explaining cybernetics with ball cocks in lavatories, which appeals to some people and alienates others. It took me until I learned statistics to really appreciate mathematics as anything actually useful or human related. And my only criticism of what you're saying, Angus, would probably be that it's too hard. It's a lot easier to understand a simple mechanical feedback system than the sort of stuff which they talk about at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. But if you've been playing in that milieu far more, then I guess, and I think all the emphases that you've given us and the need to get across a more sophisticated dialogue from what we are learning about nature is absolutely crucial. And I mean, we regularly reframe cybernetics a little bit and say this is the way in, that is the way, this the other is the way in. And I think yours has a pass with heart to choose an arcane and inappropriate reference. We could go down the rabbit hole of the mind body problem and sentience in feedback, but we can probably do that badly another time. Just one uh, corroboration. I've mentioned before that with your farm with his brown fields, I've said I run a neoliberal gardening policy, which means that I do nothing at all to my back garden in Brentford. The neighbours don't care. They do here in Lyme Regis. So I just make sure there's a path to the end that I can hack my way down. And then I let the plants dance it out together. And so this summer and whenever, my garden is green and all the nice mown lawns, etc., are brown. So if you think we're ready for this yet, it's like when you're explaining, introducing somebody into a cult, not that cybernetics is a cult, of course, you tend to start with simple things which they can understand, and you've got to look at the domain from which they come. And I think far more people are beginning to come from the domain that you're talking about, and that has a lot more to speak to us. So if I were to ask you a genuine question here, I guess it would be just the technicalities of getting people into understanding the interaction, the dialogues, which, I mean, for you mentioned Susan, have I got her name right? Synard introduced us to, and the I mean, basically, we're trying to exploit the land, the soil in this country in a different way from the one that we've done in the last quarter of a millennium. Whether we can actually do it and feed as many of us as we've got at the moment, rather than just let things run and let the killer whales take over, as I generally advocate, I'm not sure. Have I thrown out enough there for you to react to?
I'm kind of curious what the actual question is amongst all of that. I could interpret the question as, are we too stupid and simplistic to be able to do this, dealing with nature as a basis for cybernetics? But I have a strong suspicion that's not what you really had in mind. So
Yeah,
try and sum up in a phrase.
okay. Basically, give us more of the technicalities of a syllabus for cybernetics, starting from the umwelt, the ecological, the sentient information flows, which will brass off an awful lot of people, but probably bring in an awful lot of other people. And whether we will ultimately get a synthesis there, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, naturally. Yeah, thank you very much.
At
That's a
last.
really obviously important and good question. And the fact that you ask it, I find inspiring because it is a question that we need to ask. So uh, I think with all fields, the first engagement is to say, is this actually important? And is there something that makes sense here? And if it's important and it makes some sort of sense, then the question is, well, how do we investigate it further? How do we learn more? And when cybernetics engaged using the tools of little robotic machines and so on to learn and do basic and analyze how error corrections and things like that worked, it was very useful. Of course, that drew on all sorts of aspects from the past, the 19th century work in control theory, what came to be called control theory and so on. And as you've rightly said, we even play around with Babcock ball clocks, although those are really those are the mechanistic and energy responsive things. They are not quite information in the way that I was describing. I think the start point is always if we say, well, what do we not know? What we don't know, what do we know that we can draw on? And what do we not know? And what we don't know is something we have to investigate. That's how science proceeds. What's a riddle? What's a question? What's not clear? And then we have to start observing it closely and accurately and spend time talking about it and sharing learning. So I did actually start to think about writing down some activities and projects and sorts of things we could do. But I thought that it was much more likely that as a community, we could develop that if we did. My start point is only to say there's an argument at this point that we really need to understand that our society, our civilization is struggling. And if you were to ask me, well, what sort of crises do you have in mind? I could talk about those, but I think that many others could too. If going back to nature as a source for the inspiration of cybernetics as another strand, it's not that I'm throwing away the past, but another strand for understanding it as the core. Nature was there before the term cybernetics was invented, a long time before the term cybernetics was invented. It's worked really well. Let's try and understand that better.
Thank you, Angus. Let's go to Margaret. Unmute.
Yes, I know. Thank you.
Sorry.
So my question is this. Is your issue primarily with what I call the American School of Cybernetics, which went the mechanistic machine way? Because in my mind, in my reading, I've always seen a very deep natural systems origin in, with cybernetics. So whether you're talking bodies, brains, cellular organization, ecosystems, whatever you're doing, you're talking cybernetics. And you're just learning the language of these different systems or the intersystems that you're working with, but you're still looking for the same relations, types of relations, processes, feedback mechanisms, little control systems, which tend to be much more distributed and complicated in natural systems and with different temporal horizons and spatial horizons. So I'm really not, so the scale issue is different, right? Depending on this. And what we took on the American school, as I call it, and maybe Elena can come in, is we took this and we tried to understand how does this little mechanism work? And we've done that very, very successfully in every single science. So actually we've used cybernetics all through the sciences without calling it that. So I think it is reductionist of you in a sense, if this is actually the deep criticism you've got, to actually say that the cybernetic school that went, let's say, building robots, which was important to understand how things are done in brains sometimes, actually, that was actually a fundamental philosophical break, if I might say. Is this actually your thesis, that this has been the break and we need to recover the original natural history, natural system, biology's perspective, or what is it that you're trying to say?
Well, thank you very much, Margaret, for a great question. An aspect of your question, which I absolutely love or like or appreciate very much, is the way in which you appreciate that cybernetics has pervaded all of the other disciplines, although it may have been lost, or the specific connection may have been lost to the perception of the scientists and scholars and participants in those fields, and maybe even in the cybernetic community. So it's really important to recognize it is transdisciplinary and it is present all over the place in practice. I do think that I'm not trying to be anti the Americans or anti anyone. So where the shoe fits, maybe there's an opportunity for people to learn. So if they think we've been too much like this, maybe we need to reverse. That's an opportunity for them to learn. I think that at core, there's a lot of unnoticed elements within our contemporary science. I'll take the word mechanism. So it's very common for a doctor, scientist, biologist to think of a living body as a machine. It's a commonplace today. And the term machine,
No,
really, it's
mechanism
it's
is
not,
different from machine.
I know. I'm talking about machine. Okay, step one.
I spend my life with doctors. They certainly don't think of me as a machine, but they do acknowledge there are mechanisms.
Well, the doctors, the people in the medical community who are really biological scientists as well, it's not uncommon to find that I've asked, I've had them say, yes, it's a machine. That's at heart. Of course, when they're dealing with a patient in front of them, they don't think that patient is a machine, but the anatomical biological processes are considered machine-like. And the term mechanism is not the same as a machine, but it's a term that derives from a machine. Now, machines as normally understood, the whole systemic structure of a machine is different, profoundly different, I believe, from the systemic structure of living organisms. And I actually don't use the word system ordinarily to describe an organism. I call them an organism. I say there's systems and organisms. And one reason is because the systems theories have become, I think, contaminated by the view that the way the world works is that things interact with each other and something appears out of it. And I don't think that's how it works. So complexity theory, insofar as it behaves like that, the world is densely complex, sure. But complexity theory is that the interaction of these things will produce order, I think is a misunderstanding profoundly of how living organisms actually work. And I touched into that very briefly when I talked about metamorphosis and the self-referential self-creation of organisms as thematic variation of themselves. So we could go more into that. But I think that there's room for an examination in detail of the ontology, epistemology, whereby we understand the living world and ourselves in the process. And I think that there's quite a lot of radical rethinking of, for example, health in relation to gut biome and so forth. But when we look at our total food system, it's profoundly unhealthy and it's profoundly flawed. And if we really looked at that end to end,
dangerous. It's actually
it's very dangerous. If we looked at that end to end, we would radically rethink it. And I think cybernetics, exactly as you said, it is at heart. It is precisely that way of describing the world with an exact scientific way, which corresponds to the exact way in which the living world exists in its ecology of life at all levels of scale. So that if we tune into that, we'll also upgrade cybernetics. And as we upgrade cybernetics, we'll tune better into how life works. And in the process, we'll revolutionize aspects of our own cybernetics and our understanding of the world. That's my thesis. And we'll rethink the world for ourselves. We'll start to rethink how what it means to be a human being and how we live in the world. And what the scale of life is, what the recursive scales of life from small to what's beyond us.
Thank you. Angus, I put my hand up because I'd like to ask a question. You raised a lot of challenges at the end of your presentation or provocations, and which I'll come back to perhaps at a later time. But I've spent the last 25 years, one of the things I've been doing is working on promoting ocean literacy, which were two words that were put together to talk about the relationship we have with the ocean and its influence on us and our influence on it as a definition. And what I've witnessed is those two words and the associated documents go global and reach a global audience. And I think I'm very much in agreement largely with your thesis about the essence of cybernetics. It's what sort of a living process has always, I think, attracted me intuitively. What I've struggled with is this concept of ocean literacy sort of objectifies the ocean, doesn't encourage the sort of bio sensibility or sentience that I think you're advocating. And I've sort of come to a conclusion that perhaps we should be focusing to start with is our internal ocean, because we have an internal ocean. It's the extracellular matrix, one aspect of it. And, you know, the idea that if you understand the quality of the air you're breathing and you're drinking structured water and water that's pure and spring-like and natural, and you have a drainage system in your lymphatic system that's working well and your fascia are well put together, and obviously the other things like your microbiome and so on is well, that you're going to make a good start. So I'm just looking at sort of, is working on oneself or kind of educating oneself about essentially your thesis, you know, a place to start is the question. Do you think it has any possible resonance as a sort of enlightened self-interest position?
I absolutely agree with you on everything you've said, including I totally agree that is there may be two first places to start at the same time, because the examination of the world, including can begin with looking at your own body. So that's already part of the world, after all. But in the process, we're also examining our own way of understanding it. And that's very cybernetic to that reflexive self-examination process. I think it's I think I might have to just close. Can you hear background noise, or is it no? Oh, that's fine. So I think that core to my notion is what you put your finger on, that each of us individually and together as a community, learning from each other, can make a journey of seeing the world differently. And I think that the whole of humanity needs to make such a journey. Some will be ahead of others. And there are so many areas where we are so slow. I mentioned agriculture earlier. I've got a role in agriculture in local government. It is astonishing to me how much emphasis is put on agri-tech, for example, which makes money because people buy fertilizers and pesticides and so on and other tech, which they then degrade their soil with, and then they have to buy more of it. So it's a big economy and all the things that you do to try and do that more exactly with better technology. Whereas you can make a lot more money as a farmer by stopping all of that and farming differently and removing it all. But that's a scary thing to do. And our support for that nationally and locally is relatively weak and fractured. And it lacks a coherent understanding of how nature works at the farm ecosystem level. So this is just one of a range of different areas where self-knowledge is going to be really critical. And thank you for picking up on the matrix that I mentioned in the set of things that are there. It's really somewhat under-regarded as a really key
Well, I
part.
think so. I think we've got to start with our personal health and our understanding of these complex processes in our body.
Yep.
It's certainly an inspiration for Stafford, as we all know.
Yes.
Andrew, you have your hand up.
Okay, hi. I'm probably in a minority of one, but I actually worry about the emphasis in your talk, Angus, about perception, sentience, information. You didn't say consciousness, but you could have done epistemology. You make it sound as though it's all about, these very old-fashioned philosophical ideas of perception and knowledge and the senses. I'm interested in farming. I've written about farming. I like regenerative agriculture. Thinking about farming, you mentioned unintended consequences. What I see when I look at agriculture is kind of doing things, performative actions, maybe spraying the fields with DDT, and some other actions, unintended consequences come back, like all the songbirds drop dead, right? This isn't about sentience or perception or epistemology. It's a chain of performances. And I kind of follow, well, my reading of Gregory Bateson, the vision of the world and ecosystems as an indefinite number of entities that are performatively interacting with one another. The question then is whether we want to focus on performance or perception, representation, things like that. And what's at stake is, should we think differently about the world, which is what Gregory Bateson used to say, or should we act differently in the world? You just gestured at different patterns of action. You talked about how, agricultural technology, scientific agriculture, has all these bad effects. It kills the soil, it reduces a lot of carbon dioxide. This isn't a matter of perception or epistemology. It's a kind of performative thing. That pattern of action conjures up what I call the dark side of modernity. And then the question is there a different pattern of action? Which is, of course, what I've been writing about for the last few years. I call it acting with the world or poiesis. And regenerative agriculture, I think, though it depends on the detail, is an example of what I mean. We're acting with the soil to enrich it, rather than stamping our will on it. Okay, well, that's my line of thought. It's that we should think less about representation, perception, epistemology, and more about ontology and performance and patterns of action.
Andrew, I think you finished. Thank you.
Yeah, I finished.
I do appreciate your, I'm going to call it an attempt at a critique. And the reason I'm calling it an attempt is I'm not sure it's as much of a critique as you perhaps intended. And I'm not trying to diminish what you're saying. I'm trying to take it very seriously. I did actually talk about different ontological relationship at a certain point, but I did talk a lot more about sentience and epistemology. You're absolutely right. I talked about what trees do with each other and how a mother tree looks after others and how plants in a field look after each other. That's a performative activity. I talked about the farmer who planted 25 species in the field. That's a performative activity. I talked about how, although perhaps not in that much detail, but I could have said more about how a farmer next door or other farmers look at the same land and they see the soil one way, and they don't see what they're doing to it. Another farmer looks at it and thinks, gosh, I have to do something about this. And I can tell you stories of exactly that. I'm talking about the performative action, let's say, that the cow is actually on the field, not in a barn. The cow drops dung on the grass. That's a performative action and is part of its own biological process. Because of that, the dung beetle senses that and goes to the dung and starts transforming the dung through its own bodily system. That's a dung beetle sentient process. That's the umwelt of the dung beetle, is that it will fly across a field when it can smell dung, fresh dung, somewhere, and it can fly quite a long way in order to access fresh dung. And it then transforms that dung, which is then picked up by worms that are also capable of sensing it in worm-like umwelt ways. And they further transform it so that they've been described as very important ecosystem engineers in recent research reports. So those worms perform activities for the transformation of the soil. And the farmer who farms that field, planting the plants that are there, knows that with the range of different plants that are planted, the cow will select the ones that it wants to provide it with specific nutrients to meet its needs. If, for example, it's got some, it needs deworming, it will eat certain plants that will help it with that. Or if it needs a particular nutrient mix, it will pick out plants that help it with that, as well as the plants that it just enjoys tasting. And these will be natural plants that are suited to the animal's digestive organism, as a cow in this case. Now, rather than the foods that are not naturally geared towards them, but are designed to put on lots of meat on the animal for sale to people. So the farmer is observing the cow, the field, the land, and doing things through feedback loops. And so are all the other organisms that are involved, including all of those plants. That's all performative. What I'm saying is that there's two farmers, or at least there's 100 farmers and one or two, and they're seeing the world differently. And the one or two are in the process of capturing carbon, producing ecology, transforming the economy of their farm, and changing the world in a positive way. And the others are degrading their own farms, and they're on the edge, and they're struggling economically. Why is it? And I think there is a kind of blindness, that we have a civilization that has blinded itself to what it has been doing because we live so far from nature. And therefore, the performance, the activities that we perform are a consequence of our understanding of the world. I'm reframing things like Ashby's requisite variety in the process. I'm reframing Maturana, every observation is made by an observer, and a bunch of other things from the cybernetic history.
Yeah, of course you are. You're privileging the epistemological viewpoint. You're making knowledge the center, as if action flowed from knowledge.
I don't think am I privileging it or noting it?
I don't think we have any, total argument here, but I think
we don't.
It's a mistake to emphasize perception, epistemology, sentience, and things like that. What we're not very good at talking about is recognizing different patterns of action. You keep pointing to different patterns of action. And of course, one of these patterns dominates our imagination. We live in a techno-scientific world. We just don't think that there could be these other patterns of action in the world.
I agree with that.
Yeah,
if I may, just
I think that rhetorically emphasizing perception is a good strategy.
I think, and certainly the rhetoric that we use needs to be adjusted to different audiences, and whether I got it right this time, only you all can judge. But what I would like to really emphasize is, why did I emphasize sentience? And it is to emphasize the ontological difference. So what I'm saying is that again and again in Cybernetics Live, in CybSoc meetings like this, what I've heard is people describing the phenomena that they're describing. What they're describing is energetic feedback loops. They're describing physical feedback loops. And what I'm saying is that the core of cybernetics is not based is not based on energetic feedback loops in all of the different ways. It is not based on physics, and it is not based on chemistry, although physics and chemistry will come into it in the process. I'm saying that it transcends that, and specifically, what I'm saying is that the kind of feedback that is involved depends on the detection of error feedback, also known as negative feedback. And the manner whereby that detection takes place depends on the nature of the organism. So that every organism has its own Umwelt, is the term I used, by which it perceives the particular version of feedback that constitutes the error net feedback or negative feedback that it needs to navigate its world. And I'm saying that that is the heart of cybernetics and not the interaction of energetic systems, which also have a really important place in our understanding of the world and also have a place in our science. But to get back to cybernetics, we need to see the whole living world in the first place as a world that is responding in order to determine its own outcomes as agents in some way. And that is the crucial difference, and that works at complex harmonics of community to work effectively. I see Margaret has her hand up, but Peter, over to you.
Yes, sorry, I have just one question, if I may. What do you think it is about the feedback that the neighboring farmers aren't noticing or aren't picking up? What is it, do you think, that's going on there? Because surely any curious human turns around and says, what the hell's that bloke doing that I'm not?
I think there's a simple answer, which is a kind of cognitive myopia, which is a term I used in a recent paper coming out. So I think that every one of us has cognitive myopias, things that we simply don't see in the world because we don't understand it. And I think that in a way, the way we perceive the world is hermeneutic, and we constitute the world as different kinds of ontology because we interpret it in different kinds of way. That's why there is a link between epistemology and ontology in philosophy. Or it's one of the reasons. So I think that one element is that if you're not schooled in how to notice it, you don't. I'm always remember a particular video, a BBC film, in which a reporter went to the Rolls-Royce, and it was at the stage where they were doing hand finishing of each Rolls-Royce car. They might still be doing it for all I know. This was a few decades ago. And the journalist is there, and the man who's doing this hand finishing of it all says, look, there's a little thing here, and I'm just giving it a little touch in order to sort it. And the journalist says, where? And he says, here. And he says, where? And the journalist, and the man says, it's here, just here, points to it. Where? And the journalist simply can't see the problem that is plain as day to the man working for Rolls-Royce. And it wasn't a set-up job. That's just he'd learned to see things that were not. My wife sees things in this house all over the place that I am blind to. So, it's a normal feature of human beings that we don't always see everything that's in the world. There is another element, which is that there are things that human beings choose not to see because we're afraid of seeing them. And I think that's another factor. Because if you really see it, then you have to change. And if you don't know what to do then and how it would work and what the consequences are, it's safer not to see it. And I think we have a civilization in a cognitive blindness at the moment.
Yeah, that's a whole other series of talks. Absolutely. I see that Elena has her hand up.
Thank you. I thought I had it up before, but anyway, in the first place, thank you for a very interesting talk. In the second place, I think Paul Pangaro had to drop off, but there is a considerable distinction between what's referred to as the American School and the American Society for Cybernetics, which doesn't operate that way at all. But my question has to do with how it is possible to connect the dots, particularly around things like the unintended consequences of pesticide use, which, according to the New York Times article this week, leads to a big increase in Parkinson's disease among people who live near golf courses that use paraquat. And the work that Lucian Gill has done on the other implications beyond the ones you spoke about of pesticide use on the soil, which leads to it being much less able to absorb water, which leads to a lot of flooding, which we really, don't want to see. And I wonder if you had some ideas about how to connect the dots on some of those things and, get people to see them and take action.
Yeah, Elena, as usual, wonderful question and some really useful observations. Well, I'm talking to the Cybernetics Society, and I'm hoping the Cybernetics Society as a community, individually, severally, connected, institutionally, might over time develop this. And I'd really like to see us as a body think about how we might find ways of coordinating activities to do activities like that. I think food is a good example of how that might be done, the entire food chain. The IPCC, the international body that does scientific research on behalf of the UN climate science and ecology aspects, has determined that there's a need for transitional pathways or transition pathways for farmers. And that at the moment, what they're looking for is a 4 parts per thousand capture of carbon, which would enable a sort of leveling out of farming's contribution. And there's no country in Europe that gets close to that at the moment, but it is possible to exceed that by 3, 4, 5 times if you farm in the right kind of way. As you say, this very afternoon, I was pointing out that really good soil has been shown to capture a torrential flood of 11 inches of rain that fell in 1 hour, and to capture it there and then and none of it to run off. It was all soaked away because it was really good deep soil. Soil is an incredible capturing. And I was talking about how the flooding that we were talking about, emergency flooding in our area, floods in the towns, we could prevent it all. In each case, it is down to the particular field that's there. So we could start in a range of different ways in which we could say that there's an end-to-end chain. We know that organic farms, that non-organic farms, 83% of the food from non-organic farms contains pesticide traces, whereas 83% in organic farms does not include such things. So there's a manner of farming which is more nature friendly, and there's varieties of that which can take pesticides out of the system. The fact that it's not 100% without in organic is because of leaching that comes across. And you might be interested to know that the Silent Spring, if you're interested, Peter, you will know Silent Spring as part of your background, the key that kicked off the ecological revolution. When Rachel Carson wrote that, she had some silent researchers who were secretly to her. She didn't talk about them publicly, but they were giving her the information she needed. They were biodynamic farmers in New York State who had taken New York State to court and were talking about the effects of DDT leaching into their farm, and they were amassing evidence, and they supplied it to Rachel Carson, who then went out and checked the bay, found that the same problem was happening, wrote Silent Spring, and kicked something off. Now, in a sense, that's citizen scientists doing something and giving the right information to the right people to do something. I think we as a body need to think about, here's a coordinated stream. We could take one or more fields from end to end. So here's people eating food. What food do they buy? How do they go about buying food? Here's somebody farming. What are they doing? And what are the things in between? and then look at that chain and say, well, what skills do we have? Is that a chain that we have skills in that we could contribute to in some way? Could we have a project where we compile information about that from the world and maybe do some research? And we could do that as a global community, not just a UK one. Mm-hmm. And that could be done in a variety of ways, including supporting groups, special interest groups, for example, to focus on particular work streams and do that. I'm involved in one that's trying to investigate the viable system model and has come out with some interesting things. But I'd just as soon like to look at, I mean, that's professionally interesting to a number of people. This is a field that I'd be very interested in collaborating with others. There may be a different field, education. How does that work? And so on. What are we interested in really tackling? What are we interested in learning? And where do we want to try and make a difference in the world?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the great ending question, and it's certainly, I think, a responsibility of the Cybernetics Society to turn to the actions that Andrew's referring to. And for me, it starts with young people. We don't have enough involved even on this screen, and we need to look at ways to reach students in schools and in families as well. So we're coming up to time here, so I'm going to call it. Again, Angus, thank you for the well thought out and presentation and the comprehensive nature of it. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again at Cybernetics Live next month.
And can I say thank you for inviting me, and can I thank John Waters for his picture of the fungal mushrooms that have been staring at me for a little while.
Very good. Thank you all very much. See you next month.
Bye.
Thanks so much.